Army Men is one of my all-time favorite series. It's definitely a guilty pleasure series that I love for nostalgia more than anything else, but it was a huge part of my childhood. Army Men Sarge's Heroes and Army Men Sarge's Heroes 2 on the N64, and Army Men 2 and Army Men Toys in Space on PC were among my favorite games growing up. That's one of the reasons I've decided to do a replay and review of every game in the Army Men series. One thing to note right up front is that there is an Army Men World War on PC. Has the exact same title, has the exact same box art. However, that game is completely different. This is not a port of that like how Army Men 3D was a port of the original PC game. They may both be called Army Men World War and have the same art, but the PlayStation 1 game and the PC game are completely different experiences, and both are worth experiencing. As far as narrative goes, it's kinda hard to place World War in the larger Army Men universe. That goes for both the PS1 game as well as the PC game. And that's all assuming that you even take it as one single cohesive universe at all. Most fans, myself included, treat the quote-unquote original universe and the Sarge's Heroes universe as separate. I personally place the World War games, both the several on the PlayStation 1 as well as the PC one, at the very beginning of the core series, before Army Men, and as well as Army Men 3D, and Army Men 2, and Army Men Toys in Space. The game's cutscenes and overall style seem to imply that open military conflict between Tan and Green forces, as well as the Green's allies, is a relatively recent thing. But the games also tend to imply that since the first conflict, there have been repeated conflicts between Green and Tan. Between that and the lack of portals to the real world, it seems pretty clear to me anyway, that this game takes place before the events of Army Men and Army Men 2. Right at the beginning of the series. Now, as for the game's narrative, it is pretty bare bones, so a lot of this is conjecture. You play as a soldier, may or may not be Sarge from the original PC games, but I'm gonna lean towards not, since while it is a different game and experience, you didn't play as Sarge in the PC Army Men World War. Anyway, you fight your way through fairly random missions in 3 different campaigns. Stylistically, the game references World War II, and the campaigns reflect that as well. Each of these campaigns symbolize one of the 3 main fronts of World War II: the Pacific Theater, the Eastern European Theater, and the Western European Theater. That said, despite the allusions to World War II in the game's story, setting, and theme, the characters stay true to the quote-unquote source material of plastic toys that many of us played with as children, and those have M16s and attack helicopters and Cold War-era tanks. The missions feature a lot of variety. Sometimes you have to eliminate all of the Tan soldiers in an area, sometimes you have to break POWs out of a Tan prison camp, and sometimes you have to hold off waves of Tan attacks to keep control of an area. The game may be rough by today's standards, but for an early 3D game on the original PlayStation, it's actually kind of impressive, and it offers a lot of depth of gameplay. The game's pretty short, and can be beaten in just a few hours, but it gets challenging. Unfortunately, the challenge isn't exactly a smooth scale. Rather, it's like a mountain range with high peaks followed by a couple of easy low valley missions, and then another difficulty spike. However, as you play through the game and get a feel for the controls, aiming, and how the rudimentary AI behaves, you sort of become acclimated to the game's mid-90s jank. Jank which I personally consider to be a big part of the game's charm. There's one level where you man a cannon turret on a train that you are almost guaranteed to fail your first time through, as there's a train collision you have to avoid, but it gives you virtually no warning or indication whatsoever. And that is going to be a really cheap death that is sure to frustrate you. But that is the only part of the game I can remember that essentially requires dying in order to learn that it's there. The game isn't exactly beautiful, but most PS1 games are pretty ugly by today's standards. And for an early 3D game on a console not known for its hardware prowess, it features some impressively detailed environments. Again, you have to take it in the context of a 30-year-old game, but taken with that perspective in mind, there's a surprising amount to appreciate for a game in a series that's known for mediocrity and mid-budget releases. The sound design is a similar bag. It's not going to blow anyone's mind, but the sound effects are decent. The music, likewise, doesn't hold a candle to classic PlayStation 1 soundtracks like Final Fantasy VII, or Nintendo 64 soundtracks like Super Mario 64, but it's solid, and it does a good job of setting the tone. It doesn't have any earworms that will get stuck in your head, but you're also not going to be left questioning why the game sounds like it does, like the random rap soundtrack in Xenoblade Chronicles X on Wii U, if you've played that. Army Men World War has a lot of the same charms, as well as a lot of the same drawbacks as Army Men 3D on PS1. It suffers from the typical early 3D visual problems, but it does somewhat make up for this with its surprisingly detailed environments. The mission variety is surprisingly solid, and it definitely outperforms Army Men 3D in that regard. The controls, however, are just as janky, and the story is bare bones and virtually non-existent aside from some occasional cutscenes and newspaper headlines that display between missions. In that regard, it does fall short of Army Men 3D. Overall, however, it averages to be a good companion to Army Men 3D that I don't really consider to be generally better or generally worse when taken as a whole package. If you enjoyed Army Men 3D, you'll enjoy Army Men World War. It's not nearly as cartoony or polished as the more popular Sarge's Heroes games, but it does provide a somewhat grittier plastic war that may be more appealing to some. My rating for Army Men World War on the PlayStation is a C.